system put in place by the Afrikaner National Party in 1948, which allowed for lawful segregation using racial divide. The policy governed South Africa for nearly 50 years, but racial segregation existed long before apartheid even began. In 1913, the government passed the Natives Land Act. More than 3 decades later, the practice of systematic racial segregation was given the name apartheid and was extended under the government led by the National Party. The party placed hundreds of race laws touching every aspect of life, preventing equal opportunities for basic human rights to people of color, including dictating where they could live, work, go to school, all based on their race. Interracial relationships and marriages were illegal, and perhaps most importantly, non-whites did not have a right to vote. The Africans were forced to carry identification at all times known as a passbook. In 1952, they began a defiance campaign calling on people to purposely break apartheid laws in order to get arrested. People of color got onto white buses, used white toilets, and entered white areas.
Hello, it's Cardiac Champagne here, and welcome to my YouTube network. Today we'll be identifying the apartheid. This scene is taken from the Sharpeville massacre, in which black civilians had been brutally gunned down by the white South African government. This movie is set in the apartheid and is entitled Mandela: A Long Walk to Freedom. It depicts the graphic violent acts enforced by the white South African government. Brutal acts of violence had been done to black South Africans under the apartheid.
Non-violence, not anymore. Somebody wants me. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. The sentence will be life imprisonment. Amandla! You will die here.
Because they're not allowed.
Bad graphic atrocities had been done to black people in the apartheid. The white South African government had kept the bad atrocities secret. At the end of the apartheid, to do with the violation of black human rights, an organisation and body known as the Truth and Reconciliation Movement was supposed to bring justice for any criminal act done against black citizens during the apartheid. No white police, up until now, no white police officers have faced any legal criminal charges or any bad heinous acts committed against blacks during the apartheid. No white police officers had brutally beaten black suspects in detainment centres. Electrocution was a normal form of interrogation for black suspects. Even black children were subjected to bad degree of degrading violence done by the white South African government in order to extract information on the African National Congress, known as the ANC. When the black subject was electrocuted, the body would badly convulse, causing the black detainee to bleed from the eyes, nose and mouth. In most cases, electrodes would be applied to those sensitive areas. In countries like Cuba and Mexico, detainee was electrocuted with electrodes. No, the white South African government was badly brutal in the treatment of black detainees. A form of electrocution was directly enforced underneath President Botha and F.W. de Klerk's administration. Same with waterboard to extort information from detainees. These graphic violent acts had been done by the white South African government on black suspects.
By 1964, most resistant leaders, including Mandela, were sentenced to life imprisonment following.
After Nelson Mandela had been wrongly imprisoned, a new black activist had emerged. His name was Stephen Biko. He targeted college students and undergraduates and started his own black movement to rise in the midst of the apartheid. The ANC at that time had been banned and was forced underground. Steve Biko stepped up as a black activist and had replaced Nelson Mandela in the fight for black liberation in South Africa. He was beaten and bludgeoned to death by the white South African government in detainment as he died in prison. They made a movie about Steve Biko. They had made a movie about black activist named Steve Biko. The black actor known as Denzel Washington had played Biko.
Now stop right there. This is an illegal gathering. I'm giving you 3 minutes to disperse. Go home. I'm warning you.
Bad graphic acts of violence had been done to black South Africans in the apartheid. This is a factual account of the brutality done by the white South African government. The movie shows Stephen Biko's interrogation and him being brutally beaten and tortured in prison. These scenes are taken from the movie entitled Cry for Freedom. It depicts the apartheid and shows the black activist Steve Biko life and death underneath the white South African government. The movie Cry Freedom details Steve Biko's brutal injuries, beaten to death in a police cell.
You stand up in any way he chooses. Conflict if he likes, but with an open hand too.
Stephen Biko, black activist, a leader. He had the courage to speak out against oppression.
You need a black leader you can talk to.
Don Woods, white, a liberal, editor of an influential newspaper. This is the story of the...
Now, our movement seeks to avoid violence.
But your own words call for direct confrontation.
You can beat me or jail me or even kill me. But I am not going to be what you want me to be.
Plus Stephen Biko. For many, it is a cry from...
Say that we can all build a South Africa worth living in. A South Africa for equals, black or white.
The movie shows the graphic violent acts of the white South African government under the apartheid regime.
When rioters attacked black policemen's homes with petrol bombs.
This barbaric practice had been used on black informants. Any black citizen that informed on the white South African government was burnt in a tire known as necklacing.
I quote, I believe black groups, when you and others in black consciousness speak, You say?
Selflessly pushed forward the struggle of the black man. Now, our movement seeks to avoid violence.
But your own words call for direct confrontation. Armed for violence.
Well, you and I are now in confrontation, but I see no violence.
Do you say that the white government is doing anything good? But surely that approach inflames racial hatred and anti-whiteism.
My lord, blacks are not unaware of the hardships they endure or what the government is doing to them. Is what black consciousness is all about, now without any reference to the white man.
But why do you use a phrase like black is beautiful?
Because black is commonly associated with negatives. The black market, the black sheep of the family, anything which is supposed to be bad.
Then why do you use the word? Why call yourselves black? I mean, you people are more brown than black.
Why do you call yourselves white? You people are more pink than white.
The white South African government used direct violence on black civilians in order to directly enforce the apartheid.
And the lumbar puncture that Dr. Hirsch took revealed an excess of red blood cells in the spinal fluid. Time seriously damaged. Has he eaten, Sergeant? Gone to the toilet?
Not today. We'll take him to the police hospital in Victoria.
That's 700 miles.
He might escape from the hospital here. I want him in a police hospital. Mark well.
A Dry White Season is an interesting landmark of a film, and to be directed by a black woman. Palsy went to South Africa herself and researched the history of apartheid even while the fight was still going on. The film is a very harsh look at South Africa during the time of apartheid. We see the black population fight for better treatment and equal rights, only to be met with brute force and ugly racism in response.
Isn't news, but let me turn
Put your age in perspective.
I thought, see what you've done to me. When his son was king, and now his son. That's what I thought about Gordon when he was jailed, and because of my neglect, I cannot advise.
The injuries to his head and
This is a court scene for the movie A Dry White Season, where a black detainee's brutal injuries are detailed in court.
his jaw broken, his nose broken, his cheek bone crushed. Must have hit the bars when he tried to jump out of his window.
I will be dead.
The film was made in 1989 when Nelson Mandela was still in prison, and the issues were continuing to beget violence and hatred. It's important that movies like this were made to show the dangers of a racist state which has the power to act on its racism with impunity.
The movie A Dry White Season has a violent graphic nature. In this is an interrogation where a black suspect is electrocuted with electrodes. This apartheid movie shows the brutal graphic treatment of black detainees when they are interrogated by the white South African government. Even black children as young as these were detained by the white South African government and tortured in detainment. Even the bad degraded act of electrocution had been used on black children as young as the age of 11 in order for the white South African government to extract information on the ANC. No graphic acts violence had been done to black detainees during interrogation. Execution was the most graphic and brutally violent form of interrogation done by the white South African government. Bad, degrading torture was a method used as waterboarding. Even the black activist known as Stephen Biko was found naked and badly beaten in a jail cell. Even his brain had hemorrhage due to the severe beating done by the white South African government in order to extract information about a black opposition group that threatened the white South African government. The bad, brutal act of use of the electrodes on black suspects was done underneath F.W. de Klerk's administration.
June 16, 1976. Over 10,000 student protesters flooded the streets of Soweto, South Africa. Africans had been living under apartheid, a strict policy of segregation. But when protesters rose up to fight this injustice, the government's response was swift. Armed police officers turned their weapons onto the crowd, and even before apartheid, South Africa's long history of racial violence had already cost countless black Africans their jobs, homes, and lives. The policemen massacred demonstrators at a PAC rally. And within weeks, the ANC and PAC were outlawed. These events radicalized anti-apartheid leaders. While the conflict grew increasingly violent, the generation of student activists rose up to continue the fight, led in part by Steve Biko and the South African Students' Organization. Following the Soweto massacre, student protesters spread nationwide, but police violently smothered these demonstrations, killing over 600 protesters by early 1977. That same year, Biko was taken into police custody and killed in a brutal assault. In response to this violence, the international community finally called for an end to apartheid, with some countries enacting trade embargoes against South Africa. So when S.W. de Klerk, a longtime supporter of apartheid, came to power in 1989, he concluded the only way to ensure white survival was to end the policy.
Today in South Africa, 3 decades after the end of the apartheid, there's been no change for blacks. They still live in the ghetto of Johannesburg and Soweto. Living underneath the white South African government was bad, as black citizens had been subjected to a bad, degraded form of violence directly enforced by white police officers. Most blacks outside of Soweto had been relocated into black designated areas. By the use of direct brutal force, white police officers raided black homes and pulled black citizens from their properties and forced them into derelict slums underneath the apartheid law, the apartheid regime. There's been no change in black living conditions after 3 decades at the end of the apartheid. The blacks in South Africa still live in bad, derelict, slum, deprived areas which are not fit for human consumption. Racism is still evident in South Africa. The bad atrocities of the apartheid are still apparent in today.
Shadow of apartheid. During this period, the country's society was starkly divided along racial lines, dictating where individuals could live, whom they could marry, for black residents, limited to the...
Who drove the Cubans back in Angola? My army did. Who fought the communists in Mozambique? I did. And what recognition does the West give me? They nag, they whinge, they send me diplomatic communiques. Negotiate.
This movie.
And who must I negotiate with? A bunch of blacks running amok in the townships?
This movie is entitled
France,
Mandela
Germany,
and F.W. de Klerk,
they're all against me.
1997.
I'm telling you, gentlemen, if it wasn't for Margaret Thatcher,
This movie is a bad portrayal of the apartheid, and it directly twists the perspective F.W. de Klerk and portrays him in a soft sympathiser with Nelson Mandela
he will promise unconditional.
which was not the case, as F.W. de Klerk
It is therefore not the South African government
was just as bad as President Botha
It is Mr.
and directly enforced the apartheid regime
We are offering to set you
on black South Africans in order to enforce the apartheid. This is the movie theatrical trailer for the movie entitled Mandela and de Klerk, 1997. The movie is bad, as it badly twists the perspective of the white South African president, F.W. de Klerk.
They're all against me. Now is the time to sit.
It portrays de Klerk,
I'm the president. The world South Africa doesn't
a
exist.
sympathiser for Mandela,
Needs leadership.
Two men. Every day, the cells of your
shows F.W. de Klerk in a good light, Nelson Mandela's wife in a bad light. F.W. de Klerk is played by the British actor known as Michael Caine.
Who are you to accuse me? That is true, isn't it? Academy Award winners.
The movie creates a bad false impression of F.W. de Klerk,
and colors. In the powerful
as
film
in this movie, de Klerk is shown as a sympathiser for the ANC, which is bad, blatant lies. As President F.W. de Klerk, as F.W. de Klerk did not care for blacks,
Every political decision is
and gives a distorted view of factual of the white South African president known as F.W. de Klerk. The white South African government had directly viewed Mandela as a terrorist and had spread bad racist propaganda. As a direct result, people held the view that prison acted in his own best interest. People had viewed Mandela as a terrorist because of the white South African government bad, blatant lies, as the government had badly defiled his moral character. This man had been wrongly imprisoned with Nelson Mandela, as the white South African government viewed him as being a terrorist. He was freed with Mandela and acted as Mandela's right-hand man to prison. While being confined in prison, he was beaten severely, bound down with chains, no different than in the black slave trade. This bad atrocity of violation of human rights had been done by the white South African government under the apartheid, as he had been viewed as a bad terrorist by the white South African government. All black ANC members that had been imprisoned during the apartheid was chained and bound like the black man in the photo. The white South African government stepped sanctions on black ANC members when they had been imprisoned. Nelson Mandela had chains and heavy balls attached to his legs when he had been imprisoned for 3 decades. All black citizens were forced to carry a pass in segregated black areas. If not, they could be brutally beaten by white police officers. Burning the pass was an act of retribution for black South Africans. Subject of black ANC members being brutally tortured in detainment is detailed and portrayed in this film. White South African had been badly corrupt and directly tortured black subjects. Electrodes had been attached to their lips, the eyelids, nose and their lobes. Electric volts and currents had been shot through the electrodes, making the ears and eyes bleed and the body violently convulse. Water from a sponge had been drenched on black detainees' head before the electrodes had been attached. The word ANC stands for African National Congress.
Decades of government-backed injustice before it.
It was a movement to ensure black people's rights in South Africa. The ANC had been segregated by the white South African government, who viewed no different than the IRA. No, the ANC had a lot of bad publicity in the early day. The movement was made illegal in South Africa as it stood for the black people's rights. The white South African president, F.W. de Klerk, did not hold himself accountable to the bad, brutal atrocities.
Experience, they never included the authorization of assassination, murder, torture, rape, assault, or the like.
F.W. de Klerk had a bad attitude towards Mandela. It insulted him directly on national television. This program is taken from a South African news night in which de Klerk and Mandela answered questions directly from the public. In this interview, white South African President W. de Klerk badly degrades Mandela in front of the studio audience by insulting him directly. No, it's the downright insolence of de Klerk. Not once did he hold himself accountable for the bad graphic atrocities of the apartheid, when these brutal acts had been directly enforced underneath his administration. He had a bad, direct, insolent attitude and talked down to Mandela in live television. In this segment, we will look at the men behind the apartheid regime in South Africa. All the white South African presidents from the 50s up until F.W. de Klerk. And also how Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist, had been directly behind the apartheid. The same the British Empire's role in the apartheid regime. This man is directly behind the apartheid regime in South Africa. He's the white South African president directly enforced racial segregation laws in South Africa, which were not overturned until the end of the apartheid in the 1950s.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborhood.
The vote classified every child, woman, and man by race and color. Racial segregation affected every area of daily life. Sharp bill with a taste of things to come. 64 unarmed people shot dead while making a peaceful protest against the past laws. British and American investment. Mandela was seen as a terrorist by Britain and America. In 1962, he was arrested with information supplied by a CIA agent, Donald Rickard. Mandela would stay in prison for 27 years. There were several assassination attempts on Verwoerd.
His name was President Verwoerd. This is his assassination attempt. Several assassination attempts was taken out on his life. In the history of white presidents in South Africa, directly before P.W. Botha in power in the 70s, this was the man who governed and ruled South Africa. It sounds no different than a Nazi officer who had direct views on race. He passed the baton of power onto Botha. President Botha's ideas and direct views no different than the man on the screen. His name was Volster and was known in the 70s as President Volster. Before F.W. de Klerk had been made the last white Prime Minister of South Africa,
the man in power had been P.W. Botha. President Botha strongly enforced the apartheid and had not amended any apartheid laws while he was in power. Upheld the strong sanctions on black citizens in South Africa underneath the apartheid regime. Both President Botha and de Klerk had head of the National Party in South Africa. In Britain, it would be a far-right party, no different than the National Front. Both the British and the Dutch had been dominant forces in South Africa at the Cape Colony. The Dutch participated with the slave trade and were slave drivers, no different than the British. The Dutch settled in the Cape and had exploited the black slave trade. After that, the British came, and history is marked by the Boer Wars, the 2-1 won by the British. The Dutch greatly resented the British. Britain wanted to end the slave trade. The abolition of the slave trade was fronted by the British Empire. The Dutch objected the black slaves to still be bound by the slave trade. Then the gold mines was discovered. Britain owned the gold mines and it badly exploited South Africa. Then after much dispute, the land was claimed or given to the Dutch and set the scene for the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes. Queen Victoria gave Cecil Rhodes, she gave the British government the permission to grant Cecil Rhodes land in South Africa. Cecil Rhodes' master plan had been put into place with Queen Victoria's money and permission from the British government. There had been a darker side to Her Royal Highness. No, there had been a darker side to Her Royal Highness. Queen Victoria had embraced the black slave trade and had been a dominant force in the exploitation of black slaves during the slave trade. Not only that, she was bloodthirsty for land and wanted to occupy the entire black continent of Africa with British colonialism. That is where the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes comes into force. As Queen Victoria not only granted him land in South Africa, but financed Cecil Rhodes's business enterprises in Rhodesia and the Cape Town in South Africa. The British imperialist known as Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was not only a white landowner in South Africa, but he also owned most of the gold mines. 90% of diamonds in South Africa was owned by Cecil Rhodes. That's how rich and wealthy the man had became. He also badly exploited his black workers, as he used black African miners to extract the gold and diamonds from the South African gold mines, all of which had been badly treated by Cecil Rhodes. Not to mention, Rhodes had also caused a bad genocide in Rhodesia. Land expansion came at a bad detrimental cost to the black natives, as he had no respect for the black Africans. The act of racial segregation had always been in force in South Africa from the time the slave trade had been directly enforced. That was before the Boer War. The British had colonized South Africa and the British Empire ruled South Africa. And then it was given to the Dutch. The gold mines in South Africa the British was behind the discovery of the gold mines. That treated the Cecil Rhodes incited violence on black Africans in order to occupy the land and took it with force, had been badly brutal with violence against the black Africans. When Rhodesia gained its independence, it didn't want the white land slave owners' name to be the name of the country, so it changed its name legally to Zimbabwe. If you know the history behind the apartheid, from a time the slave trade had been enforced before the Boer War, the act of racial segregation has always been in place in South Africa. The black native has always been treated badly by not only the white slave owners, but also both the Dutch and the British. They had no respect for the black Zulus and the black native Africans who they stole the land from. The word apartheid is taken directly from the Dutch white Afrikaner language. No, South Africa belongs to the black natives. It's a black man's land. It does not belong to the white Dutch Afrikaans. It's a black man's country. A lot of bad graphic atrocities had been done in South Africa, not just during the apartheid, but also during the Boer War, as the British were brutal in occupying the land, not to mention Cecil Rhodes badly violated human rights as a white landowner in South Africa and Rhodesia.